Hello and welcome to video number 2 of our asset protection mini series. All right, so on the first one, we cover the concept of asset protection in general and why we need to stop thinking of asset protection as a series of documents or forms or legal entities. It's part of that, but it's a grander scope of things. So I strongly recommend that you go back to watching that video on asset protection to get a general, clear picture of what it really means. In this video, we're going to be talking about limiting liability. Why? Because limiting liability is not the same as asset protection. It's one of the goals of asset protection, but it's not the same. So liability, first of all, you can think of it as being defined as the legal responsibility for the consequences of an event or an action that has taken place or that didn't take place, right? What we call liability by omission, by failing to take a certain action. So, for example, you're the seller in a sale and purchase contract, and you may have liability for making certain repairs prior to closing. If you don't comply with those repair requirements, you're then going to be liable to the buyer for the cost of not making those repairs. That's liability, right? Other types of liability involve risk of someone maybe suffering an injury while they're on your property. And if they trip and fall in your driveway, right? Okay, you might be liable for those injuries. But what are some of the ways in which you can limit liability in those examples? Well, for the repairs, right? A contract that states specifically the sum which your buyer would be entitled to if you fail to make repairs limits liability to that specific sum. So that's a way to limit liability. For the trip and fall, you could limit your personal liability by having an insurance policy, right? That's going to cover those types of injuries, which then passes the costs and expense to your third-party insurance company, therefore limiting your own personal monetary liability for what happens to somebody on your property. What else could you do? Well, your property could be owned by a separate legal entity. So that limits the assets that could be used to satisfy a personal injury judgment to those assets that belong to the entity so that they don't go after your personal assets. Another way of limiting the liability and on who it falls on, right? And you could put up plain and obvious and conspicuous signs all over the property that caution people as to condition so that it shifts liability, the responsibility for an event happening, onto the person who comes onto your property uninvited, because now they know the risk of injury. So that is limiting liability.